webinar. Welcome to today's webinar on Kautilya's Dharmic Capitalism, its relevance today. I'm Ankur Patel, Director of Advancement for Hindu University of America. Our speaker is Sriram Balasubramanianji, and we also have President of HUA, Kalyan Vishwanathan. Glad to have you on as our speakers today. We have a nice audience from all around the world. We got Kumariji from Houston, Satish Tripathi from Chicago, the Ek Kadam Aur Foundation, Badari Talankji from Michigan, Shrikantji from Bangalore, India, Siddharthaji from the Govardhan Eco Village in India, Narendra Mehta from the Bay Area, Anil Kumar from Plano, Texas, Akshay and Akhil from Hindu Yuva, Dallas, Rashik and Jyotsnaji Joshi from Torrance, California. Namaste and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. And we're going to focus today on Kautilya's Dharmic Capitalism. And so background on today's webinar, India was an economic power to reckon with from ancient times, all the way until its economic decline in the 18th century. And so what explains this long period of prosperity? And the answer may lie in a framework of social and economic thought that lies buried in our ancient heritage. And this is what Sriram Balasubramanianji is going to get into. And he's going to use Kautilya's Arthashastra as a major example. So his book, Economics, Kautilya, bringing that together for modern times, is a national best-selling book in India. And in that book, he did three things, and we're going to talk about it: to provide structure and context for Kautilya's economic thoughts, examine his work's relevance, and to do it in a way that a regular person, even though our HUA audience is a little bit better than the normal lay people, I know we got a lot of readers and academics, but so that lay readers can follow and grasp easily. And Kautilya's thought is articulated mainly through the prism of Dharmic capitalism and its components. And some examples include his views on global economic outlook, state market dynamics, sustainable growth through the observance of environmental, societal, and familiar responsibilities, and looking at India's rich economic and philosophical heritage, making use of it, could prove to be a great asset in India's ascent. And so in this webinar, we're going to explore the contours of Kautilya's economic philosophy and highlight its relevance today. And so with that, let me introduce our speaker, Sriram Balasubramanianji, who's an economist and author, and his key areas of interest include global macroeconomics, economic history, socioeconomic trends in emerging markets, and Indic Dharmic culture in particular. He's contributed to many international publications such as Foreign Policy, Wall Street Journal, Vox EU, and CNBC TV18 as an independent columnist and commentator. He's the author of Jamba, the Joint Family, shortlisted for the 3rd annual IIAC Literary Festival organized by the Indo-American Arts Council and the Wizards. Balasubramanianji has also been featured in podcasts by Bloomberg and interviewed by newspapers, including The Hindu and the Indian Express, for his books and research work. He's an alumnus of Columbia University, New York. Sriramji, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Namaste to everyone. It's an honor to be part of this discussion. Thanks to Kalyanji also for inviting me for this event. I've read a lot of work from the HUA and have often been impressed by both the events that you have, as well as the rich coursework and the material that you're associated with. Needless to say that the initial introduction music was also very pleasant. So thanks for that. I generally don't have that before any of these discussions, so it's a really soothing experience. So having said that, I think I will quickly sort of give you an overview of the book. Here is the book for those who are interested. And it's available on Amazon, both in India as well as the United States. If you're interested, do go and buy the copy. So what I'll do is I'll try to segment my overview into sort of 3 buckets. One would be why the Arthashastra, or why Kautilya's Arthashastra. The second component is what is the book about, or what is the the model of Dharmic capitalism that that I talk about. And the third bucket is the relevance, how relevant it is. So I'll try to quickly run this through about 10 minutes, and then we segue into a Q&A, sort of a discussion with Kalyanji, and then a Q&A at the end. So why Kautilya's Arthashastra? I think a lot of people, especially who have grown up in India and have roots in India, have heard a lot about Chanakya. In passing or in contemporary discourse or political discourse, he's often associated with political acumen, strategic thinking, foreign policy, and all those facets, right? And that is the sort of mainstream discussion about Chanakya, right? But unfortunately or fortunately, there's a reason why it's called the Arthashastra. If it is about statecraft, if it is about, it should be Rajya Shastra or Rashtra Shastra. But there's a reason why it's called the Artha Shastra. And Artha, the primary sort of driver of Kautilya's thinking is that he was one of the foremost thinkers to put economic prosperity front and center of contemporary discourse. And that is one of the aims of the Arthashastra. Through my research prior to, I'm an economist by training. So I was working on, as part of my work, I chanced upon Angus Madison's well-renowned historical GDP data and the research associated with that. So in very simple terms, it basically tells you why and how India and China were the top countries in terms of GDP and GDP per capita from 0 CE onwards till about the 17th century. So my thinking was that there had to be some sort of a framework, some sort of a, a template at 0 CE or even prior for such prosperity to happen, to sort of undermine and say that everything was by chance and it was 1,000 years back. There was nothing sort of methodological about it. I found it very shallow. So I sort of went about searching for such a framework. And that's when, by chance, I chanced upon the Arthashastra and I decided to sort of venture into it. And like I mentioned, so a lot of the discussion is on foreign policy and strategic thinking, and very little was written on economics. Except for Balbir Sihagji, who is, an emeritus professor at University of Lowell. He had written a book in around 2015. There was no one else who spoke about, and that was an academic book. There's no one else who spoke about the economic framework of Kautilya in a serious way. So I took upon a task to sort of flesh that out a bit more and bring about a book which sort of contextualizes that, both for an academic and audience as well as for a common person to sort of understand and grasp. So that was sort of the inspiration. And the reason why it took me 5 years and plus for this book is because there are a variety of factors at play. One, the Kautilya's Arthashastra, for all the talk about it, there are about 3 to 4 main translations. Shama Shastri in the beginning, and then T.G. Shastri, and then Kangle in the 1960s, and then Rangarajan in the 1990s, and some other scholars in early 2000s. That's about it. And most of them are Sanskritam experts or Sanskritam translators. None of them are subject matter experts, meaning they aren't economists, they aren't financial persons or legal analysts or whatever. So one had to basically go to the text, first try to understand the Sanskritam from Sanskritam scholars. I myself reasonably versed with Sanskritam, but I had to deal with Sanskritam scholars to sort of extract the information and then bring in my sort of economic/financial background to the story and bring all the layers together and then create a framework and then contextualize it to today's times. So it's sort of 3 things, which all of them are fairly new, which required a lot of this effort. So that was, the why part. And what is Kautilya's framework? So often people associate Kautilya with Machiavelli and sort of, undermine him by comparing him with Machiavelli and his thinking, which is far, far from the truth. In fact, I deal with this directly in the book, where the Machiavellian approach is basically related to the protection of the monarchy and protection of the king, whereas Kautilya's approach is primarily for the welfare of the people, and primarily for what I there's a quotation which I mentioned in the book, which I think really sums up what Kautilya thinks. This is how the quotation goes: Praja sukhe sukham rajnyaha prajanam cha itetam nat preyam hitam rajnyaha prajanam tu preyam hitam. In a translation, it says, a king's happiness lies in the happiness of his subjects, and his welfare in the welfare of his subjects. A king's welfare consists not in what pleases him, but in what pleases his subjects. So the entire idea of the Arthashastra is focused on the welfare of the people and sustaining the welfare of the people. And the idea of Dharmic capitalism is, Kautilya put the idea of dharma as fundamental to this, to his economic framework. So in the book, I sort of defining dharma is obviously a challenging ask, but in a simplified way, purely for an economic audience, I define it through sort of three buckets. One is on ethics, one talks about responsibilities, and then another talks about the idea of a global society, and a sort of a global outlook, harmony and global outlook. So these are three buckets which I refer, which I define dharma through. And these components of dharma then map to this bigger bucket of Dharmic capitalism through the idea of a rule-based yet non-intrusive state, which means a strong state, but the state doesn't micromanage activities. And then wealth creation via global outlook, which means open trade, engaging with the rest of the world, having connections to the rest of the world, and sort of having economic policy that facilitates that. And the third part of it is sustainable growth. The idea of lokakshema, the idea of protecting the environment, the idea of welfare, sustainable growth and welfare. So these three sort of buckets of rule-based and yet non-intrusive state, wealth creation, and sustainable growth and welfare are the outputs of Dharmic capitalism, which are derived from the components of dharma based on ethics, harmony, and responsibilities. So I have sort of simplified it quite a bit, but what this tries to do is, what I try to do is that so after I define this framework, each chapter of the book talks about various components of this. For example, there's a chapter on trade. So we talk about trade during Kautilya's times, and then we talk about trade in today's times, and then we talk about some of the challenges in trade in today's times, and how Kautilya's ideas are applicable. So there's something called a Kautilyan Tantra at the end of each chapter, which talks about some ideas that Kautilya had and how it's relevant today and for policymakers. So the same thing is through, we talk about inequality, labor contracts. We talk about the idea of, there's another chapter on sustainable growth and welfare and things like that. And at the end, I sort of combine all these things and map it to the framework which I referred to, and then sort of explain it in each chapter, and then conclude, with a sort of a conclusion highlighting Kautilya's framework, how it applied in his time, and how it's relevant today. So that comes to the last part of relevance, which I sort of showcase it through these individual chapters and highlight some of the issues which are there today, and Kautilya's ideas can be mapped. So this is the sort of the broad contours of the book and of my research. And just to conclude the section, I think my main purpose of this exercise was to showcase one, the need to explore Kautilya in this angle, and the need to sort of have a serious discussion, a book which deals, which does a solid research, spends a lot of time on both the text, and provides expertise on both say, finance and economics, and also sort of lay it out for a common person. Because unless we do, there should be hundreds of books like this, in my view, of Kautilya's Arthashastra and various components of Arthashastra. The Arthashastra has chapters on legal frameworks. It has chapters on statecraft. It has chapters on spying, for example, forensic research. Researchers need to, I think, one of the goals is to sort of urge researchers to look at the subject matter expertise of Kautilya, and then, sort of establish or produce material related to that. And lastly, I think it's also important, at least from an economic policy standpoint, to sort of understand that we come from a legacy which is highly sophisticated. 1,000 to 2,000 years back, Kautilya talks about the idea of a flexible minimum wage, for example, right? So today we talk about minimum wages in the United States. We talk about $15 an hour as a sort of standard benchmark. Kautilya had thought about this idea of a flexible minimum wage, because $15 at 2% inflation is very different from $15 at, say, 7% inflation, because your real wages are very different. So Kautilya understood this concept, and he had argued that this idea of a minimum wage is important for people at the lower end, at a targeted level. But he also talked about an idea that we need to constantly assess this and keep, changing this depending on the circumstances, which basically talks about the macroeconomic environment. So, there was definitely a certain level of sophistication, far ahead of its time. And there is definitely sort of an indigenous, structure to India's prosperity. And that is something which, as a society which is so culturally and dharmic driven, I think it is important for us to sort of engage and understand that, to deal with a lot of the contemporary issues, even in today's India, in terms of policy and the flux between, or the contours between culture and policy and things like that. So the future part of the research in my subsequent books, my upcoming book is also on common era kingdoms and some of these ideas which are there in those kingdoms, is to sort of get people to do research on those aspects, and take this forward. Anyway, so with this, I'll sort of, conclude my summary and, look forward to questions from Kalyanji on this.
Great, excellent. First of all, Sriramji, I just wanted to offer you a word of appreciation and congratulations for examining the Arthashastra from a primarily economic lens. And as you pointed out, a lot of contemporary and recent research on the Arthashastra has tended to focus on the geopolitics, the political strategy and strategic thinking and international relations and alliances and so on and so forth. And there is not a lot of work or research that's been done on the economic thought of Chanakya. And therefore, I think the work that you are doing is going to be a critical contribution to our understanding of not only Chanakya as a person, the Chanakyan times as a historical epoch in Bharat's history, but also in some fundamental ways to understand the causes and conditions that gave rise to India's long-standing prosperity for thousands of years, 2,000 years or so, before the colonial era. So I think you're making a very important and critical contribution. So I want to start out by offering you that congratulations. Okay. Now, in terms of a question, so a few questions. See, first of all, one of the ways the India's past economic history has been envisioned, at least prior to Angus Madison, is that India was always a poor, illiterate and economically backward state. And if at all it is trying to rise towards prosperity, so it's a very recent phenomenon. And part of this imagination is really in my understanding, is a projection from European understanding of its own society, which is very much a feudal society, feudal structure, which was centered on land ownership and the exploitation of people based upon land ownership. In other words, the royalty and the nobility owned the land. The aristocrats sort of had divided the land between themselves, and the so-called peasantry and serfs and so on had no land at all. And therefore, they were completely beholden to the nobility and the royalty and so on. This was a feudal structure. And it has always been assumed that India also had a very feudal social structure from time immemorial. I would like to invite you to offer your comments on this hypothesis based on your readings of the Arthashastra.
Yeah, thank you for your kind words. It's sort of motivating and good to hear about all this. And yeah, I think before I answer a question, it's also important to, for your students and researchers listening in, to sort of have faith in research and doing sort of research which is sort of fairly new and not done before, because many people have asked me this question, why do you invest so much time on all this, 3-4 years of your time, looking through all these ancient manuscripts and, debating all this, which is fairly, unfortunately, a very, Indian trait at times. And I think it's very important for scholars to sort of, throw all that aside and focus on the material that is available. There is so much material available on our past, that, and there's so little done in terms of research, because only when these things come out, do we have and engage in these discussions. So there's just a side sort of observation. I think to answer your question, there are, again, 3-4 things which I can sort of illustrate to say why Kautilya's worldview is very different. First of all, see, the European model is highly monarchy-centric, okay? And everything is driven by, some sort of a divine force, which the monarchy has, and everything is towards the protection of the monarchy. So the alignment of even, say, Machiavelli, whom Kautilya is often compared, is about protecting the kingdom, right? Kautilya is fundamentally different there, because Kautilya clearly says that if the king is not competent, if the king's kith and kin are not competent, then he argues that they need to be changed with people who are competent. Kautilya even goes to the point of saying that the kith and kin of the kingdom needs to be, tested much higher than common people on a variety of circumstances and variety of incidences to test their mettle. If they don't pass the test, then Kautilya argues that someone else need to be in charge. So the idea of a monarch being some divine entity itself is not part of Kautilya's thinking. The monarch is basically a tool to enable action to facilitate welfare of the people. And if the monarch is not competent, the monarch needs to be changed. And that's a fundamental conceptual difference between sort of the European model of, and the Dharmic sort of model. And that is a very important principle. So that's number one. The second thing is you also have Kautilya, or at least the Arthashastra, where land ownership is not necessarily the state. The state owns land, yes, but the monarch owns land, but it's state as an entity that owns land. And the monarch as an individual doesn't really have complete ownership of the land. So the monarch changes, for example, for whatever reason, he or she would still maintain and protect the land, but that belongs to the idea of a broad of, a state. So land ownership still had sort of resonance of a monarchy sort of, taking control of sections of land, but the ownership was not permanent. It was more of a state and whose symbolism was represented by the monarch. And that's how it sort of worked. And one important point is there's a lot of private sector activity as well. So, for example, there are private waterways, which Kautilya mentions about, private agricultural lands, which were there. So these did not have any control. The state did not have any control of all this. It was left to individual people, besides obviously paying taxes, which, they had to do. So the idea of a private sector was quite thriving in Kautilya's time. So a concentration of wealth exclusively on the state is again challenged by this concept of a private sector entity. And as an extension, the third point is that trade was flourishing in Kautilya's times. There are Greek accounts by Greek travelers. Periplus of the Erythraean Sea is one. Megasthenes, who was one of the, ambassadors during, he had written. There are Chinese embassy notes and Chinese traveler notes, which mention about a very prosperous sort of trading community. And there were people of these, precedents, the Greeks and the Chinese in Bharat during those times. So what I'm trying to say is there was continuous amount of trade that was happening between various entities as a sort of underlying theme during these times. So how do you have a flourishing economy with too much concentration of wealth among the elite? So that doesn't again make sense, because a lot of the trade was done by common people. And a lot of the facilitation of trade, for example, taxation, Kautilya provides, for example, imports. He provides a lot of incentives for imports, tax exemptions for importers. He provides free sort of support between, say, a trader comes from Greece to say a port of Bharat. He provides, say, travel support when they move from one area to another to ensure that the goods are transferred safely. So all of this is sort of done in a way where, elite capture, as you define it, is not as apparent, because his thinking is always about empowering people across the Shastra. The idea of Matsya Nyaya. For people who are new to this concept, Matsya Nyaya is basically a big fish eating a small fish. So the idea of Kautilya is to avoid Matsya Nyaya. There is a couple of quotes in the Arthashastra itself directly, and there are a lot of quotes indirectly as a sub-theme, where a lot of his policies are avoiding Matsya Nyaya, which is essentially talking about what you're saying, where the bigger sort of, more elite sort of doesn't capture the space. In fact, Kautilya even says that in order to avoid Matsya Nyaya, the rule of law needs to be supreme. That's where Kautilya's idea of a rule-based society comes in, because he says that the rule of law and people need to have confidence in the rule of law and its execution. So that's why you see a lot of the punishments in the Arthashastra are very strict. Some of them quite crazy in today's times if you compare it to today's times. But there is a reason for this, because he wants to sort of inculcate a sense of fear among people that if you break the law, you're going to be, justice is going to come to you no matter who you are. So these are sort of contours of Kautilya's thinking across the Arthashastra, which tells you that he's trying to have a society, his aim is a society which is, where it's rule-based, where it is, the common people are empowered. It's open in terms of economic policy and economic thinking, and economic prosperity is sort of the basis for political success. So these sort of, principles, which are put, mind you, in a book, thousands of years ago, in a structure which is okay, which requires some, some authors, some researchers like us to sort of extract it, but in a fairly erudite book, as a sort of an economic, template. And that tells you that I think there is, there's a difference. So I would submit on some of these ideas on how the sort of a European feudalistic monarchy-driven sort of divine incarnation state, which is highly religious-centric. By the way, one last point. In the Arthashastra, you don't see a single quotation which talks about anything related to religion. There is no Rig Veda, there is no Yajur Veda. I mean, on religious, notions, I'm saying. There are references to some of these Vedic ideas, which Kautilya himself says that he has picked up, but from an economic point of view. He talks about Brihaspati, he talks about Shukracharya, he disagrees with them, agrees with them, mentions all this in the text. Peer reviewing in Kautilya's time. He says why he disagrees with Kautilya Brihaspati on some points, why he disagrees with Shukracharya on other points. But nowhere in the text do you see a sort of a spiritual connotation, in the Arthashastra. So in that sense, it is sort of agnostic in that sense. He's against superstition, for example, looking at stars and things like that. So what I'm trying to say is that the dharmic focus is there, but it's purely related to policy and the construct of policy making. And that sort of delineation in those times is again a very impressive thing. So anyway, so I would say these are the differences between sort of a European feudalistic sort of divine model, which is the more pragmatic, policy-driven, dharmic model, which Kautilya sort of envisaged.
Oh. Yeah, very good. So, so you brought up this idea of Matsya Nyaya, right? Which is sort of you could say it's a euphemism for the cutthroat capitalism of the modern era, right? Where the big fish eats the smaller fish, and that's just the way of the world. And you're saying that Kautilya continually mitigates against that that tendency within society, right? And that's the dharmic element that is pervasive in his thought. Now,
sorry, just one point on that before I forget. I've given a presentation. People who are interested can sort of Google this at IIM Bangalore, purely on inequality and redistribution and Kautilya's ideas on this. So the entire presentation is purely on this idea, for those who are interested. But why I'm mentioning this is, he even talks about the idea of Matsya Nyaya through the prism of inequality, where he says that, this one of the constraints of, say, modern day capitalism, where the rich keeps getting richer and the poor is sort of, finding their ways through the system. Kautilya gives ideas to sort of bridge that gap. And how do you sort of do that in some of the areas? So that's another element to the Matsya Nyaya, not just rule enforcement, but also through the idea of inequality and things like that.
Yeah. And ultimately, the problem of ever increasing inequality in wealth and income is a problem that the Western world hasn't yet adequately solved. And it's you can probably say they are not anywhere close to solving it at the moment. So, but going back to the the question of land ownership, I mean, what I'm hearing you say is that the king was a kind of a custodian of the land, right? He was not the owner of the land. The land belonged to the state. In some cases, it belonged to temples. It belonged to certain entities within the state. But by and large, am I correct in presuming that as per the Arthashastra, it did not promote individual land holdings? The people, even at the level of the farmers, the peasants, etc., they were also simply custodians, just as the king was also a custodian of the land. Can you throw some light on this, please?
Yeah, see, there is an element where the king owns land, his own land, okay, through say prior heritage or whatever it is. And then there's an element of custodianship, right? So
Of the kingdom, of the lands of the whole kingdom.
Correct.
Yeah.
So often the percentage of custodianship is far higher.
Yes.
Whereas the king himself, obviously for being the head of the state, he gets some perks, some, whatever it is, some sort of, palatial, components or land and some wealth to his own lineage. So that was there. And then, but a large section of it was this idea of custodianship, right? Individual land ownership, again, see, Kautilya neither promoted nor sort of, discouraged land ownership. His idea was, I have a set of rules, X, Y, Z rules for land ownership, for taxation, for, law and order, for safety, all, and I have a set of these things, which I have. As long as you follow all these things, you own your land, you do whatever you want, right? And as long as even the custodian also has to follow these things and ensure that this land provides the revenue for the state and the revenue. For example, if say the custodian who garners taxes from people, leads to a bankrupt state because he keeps spending on his own personal pleasures or whatever it is, Kautilya would really oppose that. He will, try to find ways to, either change the ruler or do something to sort of ensure that, that's not happening. So in that sense, I wouldn't say he didn't really promote or not promote, but he had a set of policies and ideas which people had to follow, or rules which people had to follow. As long as they followed those rules, they could, do whatever that they want. And another point again to your previous question versus this question is the idea of corporate guilds. In fact, the temple image that you have behind you is probably in a historic temple, but a lot of the temples were just not religious institutions. They were cultural institutions, they were financial institutions. And a lot of these corporate guilds, they're called Shrenis in those times, they were autonomous entities. They had nothing to do with the state. They were autonomous entities who were formed by a group of people who come together, a sort of a business organization. Let's take the FICCI, for example, in India, which is a group which brings together all the businessmen. And these entities were sort of enablers, both financial institutions as well as enablers of trade and commerce and things like that. And there was no role of the state here. A big chunk of economic activity, the role of state is limited. Another big chunk of economic activity is agriculture. And agriculture is again individual centric. If you own a land, you sort of, reap the benefits of the land, except for taxation, which is a different story. So what I'm trying to say is that the ownership, answer is this, and there is also the idea of corporate guilds and things like that, which again talk about a society which is decentralized from the monarch and functions in a decentralized way.
Excellent. So let's pick up this idea of Shrenis that you brought up, Sriramji. See, it's very interesting that we could say that for 1,500 years or more, maybe even 2,000 years, the relative economic prosperity of India was almost directly a function of the entrepreneurial activity of the Shrenis of India. Yeah, the so-called manufacturing and trading classes, which is in relatively contemporary terms, we could say these are the sort of the middle classes of the contemporary economy. And they were autonomous from the monarch. They did not. The monarch did not guide them. The monarch had no role in the autonomous functioning of the Shrenis. Of course, you're translating Shrenis as corporate guilds, which is obviously a medieval European term. But what is fascinating is, whereas India is very, very suffused with ideas of caste and jati and varna and so on. The concept of Shreni and the importance of the Shreni in the functioning of Bharat's traditional economy has almost disappeared from our Hindu consciousness, and that is quite a remarkable fact. Almost nobody is today, generating any kind of discourse or conversation about the Shrenis of India. In fact, I would even bet, a vast percentage of the audience may not have even heard of the word Shreni, right? So, any thoughts on why the Shreni has simply disappeared from our consciousness as a phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very valid point. See, Kautilya talks a lot about the Shreni as well. In this book, I don't mention about the Shreni, but in my subsequent book, which I'm working on right now, there's a lot of research which I bring out on the continuity of the Shreni, not just from Kautilya's time. I show that from the Indus civilization time, Saraswati Sindhu civilization. With Professor Kalyanji, I'm working on one chapter in my book where the existence of Shreni continued all the way till the Cholas and till the Vijayanagar Empire, where this is one of the most consistent ideas across the these kingdoms. And that's a very, very important point. I think that was one of the fundamental things which underpin economic prosperity, the idea of Shreni Dharma, the principles of how a Shreni used to function.
Right.
There's a brilliant paper by Professor Vikramaditya Khanna, who's a professor of law at UMich, on Shreni itself. It came out in 2005-06, but that really gives you a comprehensive understanding of Shreni. But you're right. See, Shreni was a very egalitarian entity. There's no idea of caste. There's no hierarchy. It was a purely Vaishya entity, purely made for commerce. And there was no sort of discrimination of any sort throughout, in most of these, structures of Shreni. And they had their own structure. There was a Shreshtin who was sort of a head of a Shreni, and then there were executive officers and things like that. So they had a structure, and there was a Shreni Dharma which facilitated this, and the idea of an entity which both served as a financial hub, where it could, at some level, lend out money, worked as a bank. At some level was a business body, engaging with the state to ensure that businesses, got what they wanted in terms of, protection, policy, taxation, interest rates. And they served as a very important hub. And I wouldn't really say that the Shreni has disappeared in India today. It's just that the terminology, and because of our, obsession with, or rather, first brainwashing as well as obsession of whatever that we inherited, and obsession with the colonial West sort of took us away from the idea. But if you look at even today in India, 70-75% of the economy is driven, or more than that, is driven by the informal sector, right? So about 20-25% is what I would call the formal sector. Formal meaning formal corporations and entities. Most of it is driven by the informal sector, by the SMEs, small and medium-based enterprises. And your Kirana shop, down your street is, thousands of, Kirana shops basically make up large sections of Kirana. When I mean Kirana shops, smaller shops, with fewer people who the entrepreneurs class basically make up large sections of the economy. And most of them are run by informal connections, familial connections. Financing is driven by, even today, by, if there's an issue within a family business, most of them go within the family for financing. That provides social security. And if all of this doesn't work, then they go to the bank, to get formal credit. So in that sense that these smaller institutions, groupings of institutions in different districts and different communities, itself is a sort of a simplified form of a Srini in itself. But the structure, the thinking, the concept, the dharmic emphasis, and all those things are something that we badly seek, if you ask me, because those ideas would really, resonate in today's world, especially in India, if you want to avoid things like corruption, if you want to avoid things like, misuse by the state and the markets. In fact, when I talk about the idea of Dharmic capitalism, I also mention this point in the book, where I say that the idea of dharma, Kautilya viewed the idea of dharma as an alternative or a third component to the binary between the state and the market.
Yeah.
So in very simple terms, in a contemporary macroeconomic environment, we have two big entities. One is the state. The state provides taxes. I mean, it provides, it gets income from taxes. It gives, puts in money for infrastructure. It puts in various schemes to sort of generate economic activity. So the state is a big driver of economic activity, right?
Right.
And then there is a market, just, capital markets, financial institutions, they enable, an economic activity, right? So any change in economic policy is moving these two levers, either of these levers. You reduce or increase taxes, you pump in money, investment, or you reduce investment, you change the money supply, you reduce the money supply, whatever it is. And then in the markets, the same thing, how businesses react to policy and how financial institutions, the amount of investment they make, and how that translates to employment, translates to economic activity and prosperity. So the levers or the strain is both in the state and the market. Kautilya argues that if dharma as a third entity could ensure that the strain in the state and the market is reduced, and dharma as a foundation ensures that these two entities are far more sustainable. So for example, if there is, say, corruption at the state, right? So the state as an entity has an issue because there's corruption at the state. And this corruption is leading to leakages and is leading to, a worse off economy. So a more dharmic society would be a less corrupt society, because a more dharmic society is far more aligned to principles and values, and that reduces the propensity for corruption at the state done by the bureaucrat at an autopilot. You don't need an entity or a legal entity to superimpose this. You already have a more refined dharmic society, which reduces the propensity. Obviously, you need the law to supplement this for people who the weirdos who go beyond this.
Transgress.
The same thing with the market. The idea of moral hazard, which some people would have heard, which is basically the market sort of favoring bigger companies compared to smaller companies for a variety of reasons. That again, a more dharmic society, a more dharmic corporate sector would naturally stay away from these things much more than normal, when the emphasis of dharma is more structural and more refined. So that is the idea again Kautilya had to sort of keep this as a foundation. So anyway, so that was a bit of a digression, but I thought of putting that point as well.
Yeah. So in a way, you can say, in what I'm understanding, you say is that what appears to be natural tensions between the different classes in a modern society, right? In a modern emerging society, which is the state itself, the extremely rich class, and then the middle classes and the poor classes, and so on. The Arthashastra is trying to mitigate each of these tensions continually through its employment of the ideas of dharma. I mean, broadly speaking, right? I mean, am I understanding it correctly? Mitigating,
not just the Arthashastra. In fact, the first chapter of the book, again, I think I saw some comments which they wanted to see the title of, the cover of the book. So let me try to show it again. So the first chapter of this book, I talk about a pre-Kautilyan phase. So this is a chapter which I've co-authored with Professor Satish Deodar. He is a dean at IIM Ahmedabad, and he's done a lot of work on ancient India. I've collaborated with him on a couple of papers as well. Satish ji and myself, we've co-authored this initial chapter where we say that Kautilya himself acknowledges a lot of these ideas were there prior to his time. From the Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana. If you sort of take out the spiritual element for a second of all these entities and look at the undercurrent of society at that point of time and some of the social principles, you gain a lot of these ideas related to Dharma. So you're right. Kautilya's idea of Dharmic capitalism is prior Kautilya and post Kautilya as well. Till all these schemes. So that was one of the threads that you see across board, which enable people to ensure that, these gaps, these frictions between various societies, these entities in various societies. And lastly, make another very important point is, look, all these kingdoms, they were constantly at war. Okay. When I mean constantly at war, they were always sort of trying to occupy another person's land, whether it's the Cholas, whether it's, the Pallavas, or whether it is during Kautilya's time. But despite all that, there's an undercurrent of economic prosperity. Why is it that, another question which people need to ask is, why is it that despite so many kingdoms changing over a period of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years, Bharat was the most economic prosperous country in the world. One of the most economic prosperous countries. I think that's where the idea of a Dharmic-based society, a Dharmic capitalistic model, and being an undercurrent of this, which is running on its own, irrespective of who was in power, was sort of a base to reduce a lot of these frictions and promote sustainability. Yeah,
and I think in no small measure, see, it's not often very properly understood that the Varna Dharma, right, the Kshatriya Dharma, ensured that conflicts between kings in adjacent states, adjacent Rajas, etc., they were contained within the Kshatriya swim lane, and it did not spill over into the Vaishya, Brahmana, Shudra swim lanes, and therefore they did not result in the kind of burning and pillaging and plundering that came with the later invaders from outside of Bharat. And therefore, what you're talking about is the continuity of economic activity and prosperity was maintained, even though there were transitions of power, there was constant jostling between kings and of neighboring kingdoms and so on and so forth. Am I interpreting it reasonably accurately?
Yeah, and why is it again important today is a very important question, for listeners as well as the younger generation. Why is this guy talking about something which is thousands of years? Okay, fine, there's a civilization. What's the big deal, right? But there is a big deal, because capitalism in today's modern construct is a derivative of a Protestant ethic. The Chinese economic model is a derivative of Chinese cultural thinking. The Japanese have a Ministry of Cultural Affairs within the Ministry of Finance, even today, which talks about some of these ancient Japanese ideas. So any society, especially a society which is highly complex, highly pious, highly culturally driven, such as ours, the way of life determines economic outcomes. Unless you make an attempt to understand the way of life, the contours of the way of life, your economic policy is not going to be effective. So I'll give you an example, right? So the RBI brought this, sovereign gold scheme recently. So the sovereign gold bond scheme. So in very simple terms, you take your gold, personal gold, you go deposit to the RBI. It's basically a bond. You get a bond in return. And then after the bond matures, both on the interest as well as the, what you deposited, you get it back, right? So it's a financial instrument, basically, trying to use, gold, which is stocked in all our houses, and use that as a financial instrument for economic activity. So when they first floated this idea, it became a big failure. And they had a survey after that among people. Academics did a survey. One of the top reasons why this was a failure was that Indian women were very reluctant to give gold. The reason given was that, it's a very simple reason, mind you, but it's a very important idea, that when they presented their gold, after maturity, after 3-4 years, they got a fresh bucket of gold, fresh, fresh gold stack, which was not the same jewel that they deposited. So they said that I want the same jewel. I don't care about the money. The rest of the money, you give it to me by cash or whatever it is, but I want the same jewel back. Right? So look at this simple idea. Gold is a cultural asset for Indian women because it came through generations. When they get married, their parents give them gold, their in-laws give them gold. So it is far more, instead of viewing like us economists, how it is a productive asset, not a productive asset and things like that, it's a cultural asset for people. And their economic choices are determined by their cultural views on certain things. So the policy, instead of the policy superimposing its own idea on the way of life, it should be the other way around, where the policy tweaks itself to suit the way of life. Then you make it far more effective. So another example is Swachh Bharat. Why is it that Swachh Bharat is far more effective in rural areas of India today than urban areas? You go to any rural place. I've traveled across India post-Swachh, in the last few years. You go to the most remotest village, you'll find a toilet, you'll find a Swachh Bharat, booth, you'll find cleanliness somewhere mentioned. The reason is we are all, in general, we're all very clean in our houses, even in India and whatever place that we are. The problem comes when it comes to society, the outside place where cleanliness becomes an issue.
Public spaces.
In public spaces. So what the Prime Minister did, in my view, is that he, with his own machinery and mechanism, catered to this very dharmic idea of Saucham, of cleanliness, and expanded that to the place outside. And now the outside entity is almost their own home. So a lot of people in rural India nowadays, wherever I've asked them why you're, cleaning even the outside, people say now we feel that our neighborhood is also our own home. So this is sort of a dharmic consciousness which you trigger to make public policy far more effective. Now it's a natural autopilot. People will be in these places fairly because they sort of attributed, their way of life is attributed to this idea. And that's why it's far more effective compared to. So what I'm trying to say is, for public policy to be effective in cultural societies such as India, I think there needs to be a very good understanding of the way of life. Right. And for public policy to tweak itself to understand this way of life, to be far more effective rather than the other way around.
Okay, so good. We're almost at the very end. Let's take a few quick questions from the Q&A box and then see if we can address some of them. So let me read out the questions, Sriram. So here's a question from Siddharth. Has Kautilya's Arthashastra created a correlation of Dhan and economic prosperity of the subjects? I don't know what that means, but do you have a sense of what that question is asking? A correlation of Dhan, D-A-A-N.
Yeah. So it's basically Samadana Bandhabhet. I think it's that Dhan which she's talking about. Yes, I think there is a reference again in the book where I talk about enforcement of contracts, where Kautilya uses this Samadana Bandhabhet principle on how do you enforce contracts, especially among business entities. So there is a link there, and he mentions it as well. So yeah.
Next question: how do you exploit limited resources like oil in a sustainable way? Any ideas from Kautilya on that?
Interesting question. I haven't explored it. Probably
Okay.
Using the first principles of Kautilya, one can explore how that can be done, if it can be done. Yeah.
Right.
But one point is he was a big proponent of sustainability, in the sense he viewed it more strategic element. He protected forests, he protected environment. But probably the Dharmic way of life itself is naturally sustainable. So
That's right.
Yeah.
Dharma itself means that which sustains is dharma, right?
Exactly.
Dharayati iti dharma. Yeah.
Correct. Dharayati dharma. Yes, that's right.
Okay. Now, many state governments are attracting the voters for freebies. Everybody knows excessive spending on freebies are not good. What is Kautilya suggestions on this?
Yeah, he was against freebies.
Yeah.
He believed in targeted intervention, which means if people are below the poverty line, he would say, I can give you some basic needs for you to sustain. But then he believed for the rest of them, it's about empowerment. The more opportunities that they provide. So that's why look, he's a very shrewd political player, right? He is probably the Narendra Modi of his time, in the sense that he understood that unless the people at the lower end of the spectrum are satisfied, he is not going to be relevant as a political player. So that's why at every stage he empowers people at the lower level, so that they're always provided opportunities. Trade, he wanted trade because it provides opportunities. He wanted to avoid Matsya because he talks about empowering the poor. He talks about giving sort of these direct transfers to the poor so that their basic needs are met. And he also talks about why people need to be, on their toes, and you can't give them freebies forever also.
Yeah.
He believed in free opportunity, enhancing opportunity for people, but he also thought that targeted interventions also are useful.
Okay, very good. Okay, how do you think these principles in modern business, for example, how do you think can help if I'm building a company or a startup? Does this equate more closely to social entrepreneurship?
No, I don't think so. I think his principles and ideas could be used for businesses today. But mind you, see, another thing is, a lot of people think that the Arthashastra was used as one-to-one during the Mauryan Empire. That's not the case. We still don't have evidence saying how much the Mauryans used the Arthashastra. For all you know, Kautilya himself would have been really irritated by the constraints of political economy, that he himself decided to put a book on his own. It just gives all his ideas together. So what I'm trying to say is, one needs to be selective in picking and choosing ideas and principles, and then using them as applicable.
So it's a compendium of principles, economic principles, right?
I mean, it's a compendium of quotations and verses,
sutras,
which talks about, and we need to pick out these ancient texts. It's very important to see the undercurrent of theme. For example, in Matsya Nyaya, if you look at just the quotation, there are just 2 quotations talking about Matsya Nyaya in the entire Arthashastra. But the idea of Matsya Nyaya is there everywhere, eliminating Matsya Nyaya across the board. So that is what we need to look at, which we can use in our day-to-day lives.
What was the time period of Kautilya? Well, I mean, do you want to comment on that?
3rd century BC is what approximately.
That is understood as a Western reconstruction of that time.
That's right. Yeah.
But there are other historians who date it, contemporary historians who put it back some. But
I leave that to them to debate all that.
Yeah, right. Okay, can you touch on what caused the downfall and how it could have been prevented? I mean, I suppose the downfall of the whole civilization is what he's asking. Nainan Desai is asking that question.
I wouldn't say of the Kautilyan Empire. Yes, I mean, there could be a variety of factors, but from an economic standpoint, I see only continuity over all these periods.
In fact, if at all there was a downturn in the Hindu civilization, it came nearly 1,000 years after Kautilya. So there's a strong case to be made that Chanakya's ideas held their ground for 1,000 years.
I mean, let's take the idea of globalization, right? It's a fallacy saying that globalization was a post-1990 phenomenon in India.
Yeah, right.
Globalization was the norm, except for post-independence. Right? All through Kautilya's times, prior Kautilya, you had a plethora of Westerners in India who were there for. In fact, the Greek current account deficit, the Greek current account deficit depended a lot on India's exports. There's a lot of evidence to suggest this.
Yeah.
Where the coins and the spices and the minerals and metals which were traded, impacted other countries. Only thing is, in those times there was a lag. Today it's instantaneous. So there's a lag in a lot of these things, but the effects and ideas are fairly similar.
Right. Okay, next question. Please define and spell what is Shreni. Okay, I'll spell it. SHRENI. Shreni. That's the. And when he says
in
define,
Sanskritam it is Shrinihi. I mean, but yeah, in Srini is right.
Shreni.
Yeah.
Okay. And how do you define it?
Define it as something called a corporate guild. I mean, it's a very narrow definition, but yeah, it's a sort of a corporate grouping which served various purposes for businesses to grow.
So, and one example of a modern day Shreni is the community of, say, Patels who are owning a lot of these motels in North America. Right? They're part of a corporate guild-like phenomenon where a community supports itself, finances itself, supports its members, and builds up a vast network of assets and business interests and so on. That's a very good example of how a Shreni functions. Okay, next question. Have you correlated any of this to the ancient Vastu Shastras, the city design as it relates to designing the cities to also support prosperity?
Interesting topic, probably for my future research. I'll do that. Okay. Thank you.
Right. Would the current government align with principles of Kautilyan capitalism and governance? Current government as an Indian government? I'm not sure.
Yeah, you should read my book and then make your own judgment.
Any quick word on that, or no? You just want to?
No, I think there are pockets. I give examples of where there are alignment.
Okay.
But this is a more structural problem beyond governments. It's a societal issue. As we move into this Amrit Kal, I think it's important for us to sort of come to grips with all these things,
right?
And then show a sort of an example to the world on how do you deal with a lot of these issues in the future.
Right. Okay, next question. How is a leader chosen in his times? Family-based or merit-based? What was his recommendation?
I think I mentioned this. It is merit-based. I mean, the first choice is given to the family kith and kin, I would say. But if the kith and kin are not up to the task, they will replace him with someone else who is
competent.
Yes.
Are there correlations between Bhagavad Gita's definition of dharma and Kautilya's definition of dharma-based capitalism? I mean, see, the word capitalism is a modern word. Okay, so reading it into the Arthashastra, so we should not imagine that Kautilya is defining capitalism.
Correct. Yeah. Just to make it relevant to today's times.
Right.
Yeah. Obviously, that's another area to explore on the Bhagavad Gita itself, which is a thesis by itself. But I'm pretty sure there are correlations, and again, another area of exploration. Okay.
What would his thoughts be if you can surmise him on secularism? Was that concept even given thought during those times?
A Dharmic society is self-explanatory. It's inclusive by nature. That's why it's Dhara iti dharma. So
yeah, and I think see, we have to understand secularism is again a Western concept originating in a particular period in Europe.
Correct.
The Hindu society was more pluralistic by its nature.
Correct.
How does it compare to economic ideas of Indus Valley civilization?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I am look forward to my new book. I think there's a big chapter why I talk about this, and there is, especially from the Indus script interpretations, I think there is a fair enough case to suggest that there's continuity even from those times.
So that's a fascinating point that Anil Kumar is asking. I'm somewhat familiar with Dr. Kalyan Raman's work on the Indus Valley script and his particular way of interpreting that script, and that goes straight back into these Shrenis, merchant guilds, transportation, trade, etc., right? I mean, and if you compare the nature of the cities of that era, in fact, the sophistication of the cities and the shrenis, the merchant guilds, the manufacturing and trade activities of that era, it actually points to a more sophisticated civilization than people are willing to give credit for during that era, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was naive enough to tell, well, since you're speaking about Professor Kalyan, when I first met him, we were discussing on the book and on my first book, and he was giving me his guidance, and I was naive enough to sort of say that industrialization is a colonial phenomenon, and then he just jumped and gave me so much evidence that I'm sort of convinced that there was substantial industrial activity during the civilization time. Again, look, interpretations might vary, quantum might vary, right? But existence, I don't think is the evidence is there of, say, metal manufacturing. There's evidence there of these guilds which we talk about, Shrinis. There is evidence there of Shreshtin, for example, a lot of the Shrini Dharma components which are there. So there are evidences of these activities there.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, quantum, how much did they produce in that industrial metalworking shop? We might disagree, agree.
Well, I mean, in this, it is fair to say, it would not be unfair to say that when we're talking about 1000 BC, I mean, the whole population of India, Bharat, the greater Bharat, all of, Khanda Bharat, would have not been more than 20 million, 30 million people, and that is it. So we're talking about a much, much more smaller base for an economy. So it'd be hard to compare it with today's ideas of mass manufacturing, industrial manufacturing, and so on. Okay, here's another question. I just took a course on principles of Arthashastra in the 21st century by Dr. Radhakrishnan Pillai. How do your interpretations tie up with his interpretations? Have you connected? That's a question.
Yeah, Dr. Pillai launched this book. We had a virtual launch with Dr. Pillai and Professor Satish Deodar, Anand Ranganathan. Just Google this with my name. You should be able to see the discussion. He is very, in fact, he's a very kind person, and his ideas of Kautilya, has really taken it to the masses in terms of business ideas and business principles and things like that. He's a very humble man, and it's because of people like him, I think the idea of Kautilya is still resonating with a lot of people. So yeah, so I mean, there's probably not one-to-one alignment, but philosophically and based on his work, I have a lot of admiration for him.
Great. Terrific. I think that brings us to the end of the webinar. I don't think we have, here's one more. Rajendra Paul, famous line on economics from the Upanishad. Okay. So wealth is for dharma, not self-esteem. Correct in Dharmic Shastra. Okay. Long question, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, there are definitely correlations. Those are areas which I'm still exploring. But see, individual references is one thing. A structured framework is another thing. I think to make a lot of these ideas relevant, you need work to bring together a lot of these ideas and construct it. Because in the construction of Arthashastra, there is a tantra, there's a technique called tantra yukti, which I think some of your seminars have dealt with. There's even a subchapter in this book where why the way the Arthashastra is written is very different to how we perceive as logical writing today. So we need to sort of extract a lot of these principles from those times to derive the logic, and then create a framework and which is relevant to today's times, so the white man can understand this, and obviously the Indian who's consumed by the white man's ideas also understands.
Right. That's right. Okay. My understanding and observing the reality, the past 9 years of Swachh Bharat is cleansing and cleaning even more than streets, railways, airports, roads. It is also cleansing of corruption, systemic plunder, etc. Would you agree?
That's a political question, which, is beyond this, it's for you to decide, I would say.
Yeah, okay. Are there any other kingdoms in India that followed Kautilya's
Yeah,
Arthashastra?
definitely. Wait for my next book. I will come back to you guys in another 6-7 months, I hope, with that presentation.
Any comments on contemporary economic activity? Greco-Persian.
There is references to Greeks and Persians within the during the Arthashastra time. So yeah, but I haven't really explored their models, for example.
Okay, everybody, I think we should bring the webinar to a close. A lot of people have left already. So I don't know if Ankur is still here, but Sriramji, thank you very much for your time today. Really, really appreciate it. Over to you, Ankur.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Great conversation, really engaged audience. I dropped a link to Sriramji's book in the chat. So if you'd like to check that out, please do. Amazing conversation. Continue to engage with Hindu University of America. Think about taking a course. We'll continue to bring you interesting and engaging webinars every Saturday at 9 a.m. Pacific time, noon Eastern time. That's it from my end, Kalyanji. Oh, maybe the Gita Pariksha. Should I let people know about that? Why not? One last little pitch. We're doing a Gita Pariksha test on your knowledge and understanding of the Bhagavad Gita. And there's a $25,000 prize pool. So if you are interested, I'll drop a link to that in the chat. Take a look at that. This one is specifically for the North Carolina area, but we will bring it to your local area if you're interested. I'll drop a link to that in the chat. And again, thank you everyone for joining today's webinar with Sriram Balasubramanianji on Kautilya's Dharmic Capitalism. Great.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Terrific.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Namaste. Bye-bye.
Thank you.